We're about to interview Mr. Kye Swede Swenson, who was born on October 7th, 1924. He served during World War II as a member of the United States Navy. His rank was Seaman First Class. My name is Mark Baker, and this interview is being held in Saugerties, New York on Memorial Day, May the 30th, 2011. Assisting me with this is Mr. Alan Grzinski of the American Legion Post 72 of Saugerties, New York. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. Mr. Swenson, can you answer a couple of questions about your life and your biography? Could you please tell us where and when you were born?
I was born 7 October 1924 in Brooklyn, New York.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about your family, your parents, their occupations, the number of brothers or sisters you may have, and what gender they are?
Well, my father came from Sweden as an immigrant in the early 20s, as did my mother, and but they met and married here. And my father was an editor of a Swedish newspaper in Manhattan, New York, called North Star, Nordstjernan. And my mother, I guess what we call a literary agent. She helped publish books for a lot of Scandinavian authors and so forth. Family-wise, I have a younger sister, Greta, and a younger brother named Arnie. And they are still alive, and one lives in Long Island, my sister, and my brother lives in no, let me see. My sister is out in Levittown, Long Island, and my brother is in Summit, New Jersey.
Thank you. Could you tell us what you were doing, what occupation, before you entered the service? And at what age you did?
Basically, I was a sailor. I had gone to sea in the summer of '41 on the Swedish passenger liner, the Gripsholm, and also the Stockholm. And when I got home from that, my father thought it would be a good idea if I went to sea aboard a Swedish sailing ship, full-rig sailing ship, no engines. And which I did. I was 16, and I went to Santos, Brazil, and happened to be there when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So there was a lot to do that Sunday even in Brazil. And eventually I got to get home and then joined the Navy on November 23rd, 1942.
Did any other members of your family serve in the military, Mr. Swenson?
Yes, my father served in the what we call the Swedish ski troops in World War I.
Now, sir, let's talk about your early days of service, if we may. Were you drafted or did you enlist? I believe you just stated you enlisted, is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us why you enlisted and why did you choose the United States Navy?
Well, it was a pretty obvious choice, having been to sea aboard a sailing ship, and I learned quite a bit about the sea and navigation and so forth. So I thought that might be best to join the Navy. So that's what I did. Wound up in Sampson, New York, boot camp, and I would say until we went aboard the destroyer USS Thorn DD-647 in Brooklyn, New York, and that was, believe it or not, on April Fool's Day, 1943, April 1.
Did you have any special training while you were in boot camp? And what were those days like for you when you were in boot camp?
In boot camp, my training was how to get the clothing off the wash line, which had frozen. It was 46 degrees below that winter. And so I, having had that experience on the sailing ship, they decided I should take it down to the dock and get in a whaleboat and teach these new sailors how to row. And they thought that was pretty funny because the boat was frozen in the ice, but we learned how to row the boats and everything, so that they did learn something. And years and years and years later, the guy said, "I can't believe you made us do that out in that 46 degree below weather and a boat frozen in the ice," but we did it. Navy said do it, and we did it.
Now, you stated you had previous experience as a sailor, but I need to ask, did you have any problem adapting to the physical regimen, the barracks, the food, or the social life of being a sailor?
Nope, I had no trouble. We had a good crew even in boot camp. A lot of guys that I'm still friends with today. There was probably about a dozen guys from boot camp that came aboard the Thorn with me, so we stayed friends aboard the ship, and even till this day.
A couple of questions I have about your wartime service, sir. We understand that you served on the USS Thorn. Is that the only ship you served on?
Yes.
Did your ship ever go abroad? And can you give us some details of any cruises abroad?
Well, when we were commissioned, we did what we call a shakedown run up to Casco Bay, Maine, and then we came back and we took a convoy to Casablanca, came back, took another convoy out and stopped in the Azores, and again out and back to the Casablanca, and then eventually we picked up the what we called I think the West Point, but it was like a troop ship, and we brought her into the Mediterranean, and the British picked her up, and we then came back through Gibraltar and back into New York. And at that point, we went from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And we spent the remainder of the war there until the Japanese surrendered.
Was your passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the canal, or did you go around the Cape, sir?
No, it was through the canal.
Did you witness, you talk about convoys, but during your time on the Thorn, did you witness any action? And other than that, what were your duties when you were not in action or on the front line?
Well, as we say, feast or famine. It was either go like heck to get an invasion, and then you sat and waited for another invasion. But it was a good duty, and we had, I would say, the Pacific was probably the most. We got no battle stars or anything from our convoys, but we did, as we say, break in the ship and the crew at that point, so it worked out pretty well when we went into the Pacific. We had, as far as, I can't remember all the invasions, but we had 7 battle stars, as they say, and from the Admiralties Palau, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and then South China Sea, and then eventually we were waiting off Japan for the big invasion that was going to come up, and then they dropped the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we still didn't think that the war would be over because there was such a delay in the Japanese making up their minds, and then eventually they did sign the surrender, and everybody deep sigh of relief, and we said okay now, and we went into Tokyo Bay, and we were in Japan for, I would say, maybe 2 or 3 months before we did, as we say, had enough points to come home. And then we went down through Sumatra, Singapore, Colombo, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and to Cape Town, South Africa, and then we headed straight up to New York. Got home in exactly 4 years from Japanese attack, 7 December 1945. At that point, everybody either was reassigned or went home for discharge.
This may be difficult for you, sir, but I have to ask, what were your emotions during combat? Did you witness casualties, sir? What destruction, and how did it affect you as a person?
Well, we ourselves never had a casualty, and I would say, if anything, you get to know your job pretty well, so you don't really think, you more or less react to what's going on. And if there's aircraft attacking, you've been trained to react to that, and so same thing with any undersea submarines. We get after them too. And we learned that over in the Atlantic off of the Azores. The convoy was attacked by a German wolf pack, and so we learned how to get them. Never did know if we got any of them, but so I guess that's about it. You don't really think about it, just do it.
During this period of your life, while you were in service, did you create were any friendships formed or any camaraderie with your fellow servicemen?
Yes. There were a few that you ran into that were a pain in the neck, but by and large we had a great crew. We had, I guess, at one time aboard ship there's 250 or 60 men, and during the time that she was in commission we had a total of 615 guys that served on board the Thorn. And after the war we decided to start looking for some of our shipmates when we found our Thorn in mothballs in Philadelphia. And after 25 years of searching, we accounted for all 615 of the guys. And to this day, we have 108 still surviving out of 615.
If I may, as a son of one of your fellow shipmates, could you relate the story about that reunion and how my father found you?
Yeah, that's quite quite unique, I guess you would say. We had one of our shipmates, and you have to understand, over a period of 40 or 50 years, a lot of us changed shape and everything. And as a result, one of our guys, who was 98 pounds, soaking wet and about 6'1", and he came to the reunion, and all of a sudden he was about 300 pounds and had a big, full, scruffy beard. So we had, who the hell is this guy? And he said who he was, and we didn't believe him until he answered a few questions, and then we found out he really was the guy that he said he was. And then he begins, we talk about different guys, and we wondered about your dad by the name of oh gosh, what was his name again? Let me see. He was an old friend of mine. I think Malvin Drury Baker. And we asked about him, and he said, oh yeah, he passed away. And I said, you're kidding. He said, yeah. I said, well, how'd you hear that? I don't know. I just heard from somebody. And within hours, I guess, all of a sudden we got a telephone call in the hospitality room. And it was a guy claiming to be Malvin Drury Baker from the Thorn, who served on the Thorn. And we said, you can't be, you're dead. And he said, who told you that? And he said, Wild Bill Crandall. And he said, that guy can never get anything right on a board ship. And he said, I am alive and I am in the hotel down the street from where you are, and I'll be up in a short while. And he came up and we saw him again, and sure enough it was Mal Baker. And needless to say, Mr. Wild Bill Crandall said, oh my God, maybe it was somebody else that died. So anyway, that's how we got to see your dad again, and it was really great to see him again. And he was a close, well, I'd say a good friend, because when we came aboard the Thorn the first time, most everybody says, anybody here from Carolina, anybody here from Ohio, whatever, and all of a sudden I heard somebody say, anybody from Brooklyn? And I said, yeah, I'm from Brooklyn. And he said, where are you from? And I said, Garrettson Beach. He says, you're kidding. And I said, why? He says, I live down Lake Avenue. It's on the way to Coney Island. And I said, no kidding. So it turned out to be your dad, and we lived within maybe a mile of each other growing up. And so we became, as a result of that, fast friends aboard the ship, because we were from an area of Brooklyn that nobody else ever knew about. So even afterwards, we kept in touch. And then, as you would gather, even when he passed away and his wife passed away, it was a tough loss. But in any event, that happened. So that's how we got to see Mr. Mal Baker again, and despite trying to be killed off by another sailor.
Now, thank you, and could you give us some idea about what decorations you may have received during your service in the Navy? I believe we have a picture of them here.
Well, we have, oh gosh, I'm not sure the name of the medals anymore, but
would you like to look at the photograph?
One is for the Atlantic and African. Then we went to the Pacific and we got that. And we had 7 battle stars for the invasions that we were in. And we have 2 aircraft shot down and the Japanese destroyer sunk. I think that's pretty much the record.
Could you tell us what division you served in on the Thorn?
Yep, I was what they called the deck division, which basically took care of the ship topside. And basic jobs were painting and scraping and keeping everything ship shape topside. Standing watches and that sort of thing. So
question must be asked, because comrades in arms aren't always on a ship, and they do have off-duty pursuits. Could you tell us how you and your shipmates recreated on a leave or liberty from the ship?
We didn't have too many. The Atlantic trips were the best because we always got back to New York, our home port in Brooklyn, and then went out to the Pacific. And as it turned out, during the preliminaries in the invasion of Hollandia, we struck an underwater reef and we banged up the propellers and we had to come back to San Francisco for repairs. And that was the basic U.S. liberties we had until after the war. The other times we had were some of the islands that we came close on that were basically going ashore to have a can of beer or something. And our favorite spot of all for most of the shipmates was Bora Bora. And I was fortunate enough to take my wife on a trip to the Pacific, and we saw Bora Bora again. So
I believe you answered this question earlier. You stated that you were on board ship of the Thorn, on the ship, the Thorn, at the end of the war. And could you tell us approximately where the ship was located when you heard of the dropping of the bomb, and where you were at the signing of the, let's say, peace treaty? Or the surrender of Japan, I say, sir, because that's what we did. We made them surrender.
Yep, we were about 100 miles off Japan, and when we found that they eventually signed the surrender papers on the Missouri, then we were waiting again another week or so to make sure there wasn't any tricks by the Japanese, and then we were allowed to come into Tokyo Bay. So we stayed in Tokyo Bay for a while. We pulled up alongside of the Japanese battleship Nagato, and we stayed there. They were pumping oil into her. They were going to sail her back to the United States as a war prize, but it never came about. She was eventually sunk off of the island of Bikini during the atomic bomb tests.
In conversations I had with my father, he spoke about war prizes, mementos that several sailors brought back on board. Could you relate to us some of those experiences? Because as I remember, my father brought home a Japanese 25 caliber rifle. Did you bring home anything? And was it just scavenging through warehouses, or how did you come about these mementos?
No, as I mentioned, we tied up alongside of the battleship Nagato, and we were told that you guys can grab any souvenirs you want. So I got a Japanese sailor's helmet. I did also get a rifle, and then happened to find a little diary that was made by a Japanese sailor on board the Nagato. So 50 years later, I had it translated, well, not detailed translated, but just in general what they were saying. And then a friend of mine married a Japanese girl, and we had her go back to Japan and see if they could find out who this sailor was. And fortunately, she had discovered in Tokyo that there was a Nagato Association. And the guy was, believe it or not, still alive north of Tokyo. And they invited him to come in, and they presented him his old diary, in which he thought he burned in, or because they didn't want the Americans to get any secrets or anything. But he did get it back, and he was very, very happy that he could give it to his children, which he did. And he met again this young lady and this friend, and he gave them a kind of a, I guess you call it a poster, that he painted of the battleship Nagato when she was in her prime condition. So it was very nice, and unfortunately the guy passed away, I think 2 weeks after this happened, so it was kind of a shame, but that's how life goes on.
Sir, you mentioned earlier about at the end of the war, and returning, men had to wait for their points in order to be discharged. Where and when were you discharged from the service?
When we returned to New York, or Brooklyn, after Brooklyn Navy Yard, after the war on December 7th, 45, some guys were discharged immediately because of age, time in the service, and so forth. And I was one of the younger ones. I was 18 when I went in. So I didn't get out or was discharged until December 28, 1945, and then I was able to go home. At that time, my family had moved to New York, so it was a short subway trip to go home.
Now, I believe you, in our travel the other day when you were coming here to visit my family and my father, you went home to your parents' house. Were they there?
Well,
in Garrison Beach?
Yes. No, my folks had moved to New Jersey, and when we came back from Casablanca one time, I said, I think I'll run home to see my folks, and when I got there and knocked on the door to get in the house, some lady started screaming. She said, "Who are you? Who are you?" And I said, "I'm coming into my house." And I thought this lady was a friend of the family visiting. And it turned out that my folks had moved away. Well, we were over in Casablanca. So I had to wait till I got back to the ship, and when I finally got a letter, I found out where they had moved. But the people in New Jersey just said, well, they moved to New York. Well, New York's a pretty big place. So eventually I found out they moved to 96th Street and Weston Avenue in Manhattan. So that's when I finally got to see my folks again.
When you finally did return home after your years of service, what was your reception like by your family and your community?
Well, I would say it was nice. It was, they were, well, of course, family's always happy to see the long-lost son come home. But there was no big deal about it, really. I mean, everybody just was looking to find a job and go back to work and raise a family.
And that leads me to the next question, sir. How was your readjustment? Was it difficult? Did you have trouble finding a job? I recollect the best years of our lives, many servicemen in the movie had troubles readjusting and were given responsibilities during their service and then were treated with less respect when they tried to find a position or an occupation.
No, I didn't have that problem. The problem I had was trying to decide what did I want to do with my life. And I had really no idea. And I was fortunate enough to contact my father about it and also a favorite uncle. And my father decided, well, I think you should go into what we call radio, which is communications, really. And my uncle said, well, if I were you, I think air conditioning is the thing to do, to get into. So I flipped a coin and it came up air conditioning. And so I got a job with Carrier Corporation, air conditioning company. And next thing you know, I was all over the country on startups and troubleshooting jobs. And as luck would have it, I was in a town called Allentown, Pennsylvania, putting air conditioning in the building, and I was out eating one evening with a friend, and I saw these two young ladies come in, and I said, boy, that girl is cute. And I got the waitress to send a little note over, would they mind having a date with us? And they said yes, they would be very happy to. When? We said tomorrow. And we had dates, and within 8 months I married the girl.
How long were you married to your wife, sir?
I was married 60 years, in fact, almost 61. And then she passed away from cancer.
You mentioned the Thorn Association earlier in reunions. Could you tell us how that association came about and your role in that association?
Boy, well, my number 2 son was always bedeviling me about, Dad, don't you ever wonder whatever happened to your old ship? And I said, no, because it's probably made into razor blades by now. And he said, well, don't you want to know? And just to get him off of my back, I wrote a couple of letters and I got an answer from Washington, and they said that of all things, the thing was 60 miles from my home in Philadelphia. So I took the family on a car drive to Philadelphia, and we went back aboard the old ship. And I couldn't believe everything was pretty much as we had left it. The life jackets were still on the bunks, helmets were there, the bunks were made, and the records were still there in the yeoman's offices, and drawings, everything. It was amazing. So one thing led to another. We had been at that time with contact with friends with, I would say, birth announcements, Christmas, and so forth, with about a dozen guys. And so I contacted them and I said, what do you think we ought to do? And they said, why don't we try and have a little get-together? So we checked with the guy in the Navy Yard in what they call Philadelphia, and they said, well, you guys might want to decide to do it pretty quick because she's due to be taken out and sunk as a target ship off Florida. So we did just that, and luckily we had her for 3 different reunions. And by the time she was taken out and sunk, we had located about 315 of the guys. So from there until about, I'd say 25 years later, when we did finally count for every 615 of the guys, we were still pretty much, we had reunions and we had a great time together.
Sir, I must, in this interview, let those who watch it know that you are the president of the Thorn Association, that from your office in your basement, am I wrong, that you run the entire organization and maintain the memory of the Thorn, am I correct?
Yeah, yep. We had more, but most of them unfortunately passed away. There was just myself and the vice president left. Our treasurer is pretty bad off, and treasurer has died, so I'm doing kind of dual duty as a treasurer and president right now. But there's so few people left, it's not that all that big a job anymore. So I'm going to try and do it as long as I can.
And for that, I thank you.
We're able.
As we're coming to the end of this interview, are there any life lessons that you'd like to share with us about your service to the United States?
Well, if I had my druthers, I would like to see every young American boy spend at least 2 years in one of the services. I think it's a great, living lesson as to how to do things, how to take orders, how to learn how to do things. And I think they would be, as a result, a lot better person as a result. And you will be able, with that, to be able to raise a family and hopefully have a long marriage without any divorces and so forth, which I was very fortunate enough to have that. That my wife at 60 years didn't toss my butt out many years ago.
In conclusion, I and my generation would like to thank you and your generation
Well, thank you.
for your sacrifice.
And I thank my father for his service in the Swedish ski troops and fighting the war in World War I. So each generation has their own cross to bear, I guess you'd say. But I think the military would be great for every kid if it could be worked out that way.
At this time, I would like to thank the American Legion Post 72 of Saugerties, New York, and Mr. Bill Payne and Mr. Alan Grzinski, the curator and assistant curator of the Museum of the Legion here in Saugerties. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay, thank you guys as well.
Okay.
And in conclusion, I would like to say, God bless America.
Right. Very good.
And in conclusion, I would like to say, God bless America.
Right. Very good.